The storm howled like a wounded animal outside the station. Snow whipped against the platform in violent, swirling eddies, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The dim station lights flickered under the onslaught of the blizzard, casting long, uncertain shadows across the empty benches. I pulled my coat tighter around me, my breath fogging up the air as I checked my ticket for the 100th time. Aurora Express departs 11:57 p.m. There was no track number, no departure gate, just the time. The ticket clerk had looked at me strangely when I purchased it, her lips pressing into a thin line before she handed it over. "You sure you want to take that train?" she had asked. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "Just don't break the rules." Now, standing alone in the biting cold, those words clawed at the back of my mind. What rules? No one had told me anything else. I was only taking this train because my father, who had lived in Alaska his whole life, had left me a letter urging me to take this specific journey after his passing. "You'll understand when the time comes, Katya. Just remember, the train is real. The rules are too." The clock on the station wall clicked to 11:57. A deep, shuddering whistle cut through the storm. The Aurora Express materialized from the blizzard like something out of a dream. Or a nightmare. Its sleek black exterior shimmered like obsidian, glistening under a strange, ghostly glow. The train didn't slow as it arrived. It simply wasn't there one moment. And then it was. My stomach twisted. The doors hissed open, revealing a warm, inviting interior bathed in golden light. It was a stark contrast to the howling winter outside, and yet something about it felt wrong. Still, I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the temperature around me shifted instantly. The icy wind vanished, replaced by a cozy warmth that seeped into my frozen limbs. The walls gleamed with polished wood. The floors were covered in thick, luxurious carpets, and chandeliers swayed gently overhead, illuminating the long corridor ahead. It felt too perfect. I walked forward hesitantly, my boots barely making a sound on the soft carpet. A conductor in an old-fashioned navy blue uniform stood by the entrance, his face pale and unreadable. He inclined his head as I approached, extending a gloved hand. "Ticket." I handed it over, my fingers trembling slightly, though I wasn't sure why. He studied it for a moment, then slid it into his pocket and fixed me with a gaze that sent a chill down my spine. His eyes were too dark, almost black, like two endless voids. "Welcome aboard, Miss Ivanov," he said. "Please remember the rules." There it was again. "What rules?" I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. He gestured toward the small plaque beside the door. The letters were engraved in gold, but they weren't decorative. They were a warning. "Rules of the Aurora Express. Do not open the window shades between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. If you hear knocking on your cabin door, do not answer it. No one will be there. Passengers must not attempt to leave the train until arrival. If you see someone in your cabin who shouldn't be there, do not acknowledge them. You will see things that do not make sense. Do not question them. At exactly 3:15 a.m., you must be inside your cabin with the door locked. Do not open it until morning. Breaking the rules has consequences." A cold sensation crept up my spine as I read them. "What happens if I don't follow them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The conductor gave me a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his hollow eyes. "You don't want to find out." I swallowed hard. Somewhere deep in the train, a distant clock chimed midnight. And that's when the first knock came. The sound was soft at first, a gentle, almost hesitant knock-knock-knock against the wooden door of my cabin. I froze. It could have been anything, a trick of my imagination, the settling of the train, even just another passenger who had gotten the wrong room. That's what I told myself. That's what I wanted to believe. But then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. More insistent this time. I forced myself to take a step back, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. My eyes flicked toward the small plaque mounted on the inside of my cabin door. The rules stared back at me, the gold lettering seeming to glow in the dim light. Rule number 2. If you hear knocking on your cabin door, do not answer it. No one will be there. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. It didn't make sense. Someone had to be there, but I wasn't about to test the warning on my very first night aboard the Aurora Express. I took a shaky breath and backed away until my knees hit the edge of the plush bed. The knocking didn't stop. Knock, 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 steadier now, louder. I clenched my fists, pressing them against my legs to keep them from shaking. My father had warned me. He told me the train was real, that the rules were real. So I sat still. I didn't move. The knocking continued for what felt like an eternity, and then it changed. The sound of knuckles on wood gave way to something else, something worse, scraping, like fingernails dragging against the surface of the door, long, deliberate strokes, slow and methodical. My entire body tensed. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my lips together to keep from making a sound. Whoever, or whatever, was outside my door wasn't leaving. I turned my head slightly toward the window. My cabin was bathed in a soft, eerie glow from the swirling northern lights outside, the colors shifting like a living thing. The landscape beyond the glass was nothing but a blur of snow and darkness as the train cut through the Alaskan wilderness. And then, I saw it. A reflection in the glass. My breath caught in my throat. There was someone standing outside my door, a shadowy figure, just barely visible in the dim light. The shape was humanoid, tall and thin, but its posture was wrong, twisted somehow, like its limbs weren't put together correctly. It stood motionless, facing the door, its head slightly tilted. My stomach lurched. I wanted to look away. I should have looked away, but my body refused to move. The scraping against the door stopped. Silence, and then the handle turned. I sucked in a sharp breath, my pulse spiking. The knob twisted just slightly, the metal creaking as if someone was testing the lock. I barely suppressed a whimper. The lock held. A moment passed, two. Then, slowly, the handle released. The shadow in the reflection didn't move. I stayed frozen, my fingers digging into the sheets beneath me. The silence was deafening, stretching so long that I started to wonder if I had imagined the entire thing. Then, a whisper, right against the door. "Let me in." A breathy, unnatural voice. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. My entire body broke out in cold sweat. I clenched my jaw so tightly it ached. I would not open that door. The whisper came again, this time lower, almost pleading. "Let me in, Catherine." My blood ran cold. It knew my name. I bit down hard on my lip to keep from making a sound. If I acknowledged it, would it get worse? Would it try harder to come inside? My fingers dug into the mattress as I waited. The shadow at my door didn't move for what felt like hours. But eventually the whispering stopped. The handle remained still, and then, soft footsteps, retreating, fading down the hallway. The cabin was silent again. I didn't sleep that night, morning on the Aurora Express. When the first golden rays of sunlight streamed through my window, I finally let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I was exhausted, but alive. A small part of me wondered if I had imagined the entire thing. If it had just been some horrible dream, twisted by exhaustion and the eerie setting of the train. But when I got up and walked hesitantly toward the door, my stomach dropped. There, etched into the wood, were deep, long scratches. I reached out and traced them with trembling fingers. It hadn't been a dream. A sharp knock at the door made me jump. My breath hitched. For one horrible moment I thought it was back. But then, "Miss Ivanov?" A new voice. Normal, human. "The dining car is now open for breakfast." I exhaled, barely realizing I had been holding my breath. I hesitated before finally unlocking the door and stepping outside. The hallway was empty. There was no sign of the thing from last night, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been outside my cabin. But the scratches on the door remained. And as I walked toward the dining car, a sinking feeling settled deep in my chest. This was only my first night on the Aurora Express, and I had 6 more to go. The hallway outside my cabin was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I took slow, deliberate steps, my boots sinking into the plush red carpet, my ears straining for any sound that would confirm that I wasn't alone. The memory of the scratches on my door was fresh in my mind, a reminder that something had tried to get inside. something that knew my name. As I reached the end of the corridor, I hesitated before stepping through the arched doorway leading to the dining car. A warm, inviting light spilled from within, accompanied by the soft clatter of utensils and murmured conversations. For a brief, fleeting moment, the normalcy of it all made me think maybe, just maybe, I had imagined what happened last night. Then I stepped inside, and the feeling of wrongness returned tenfold. The passengers. The dining car was elegant, almost unnervingly so. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting shimmering light onto the glossy mahogany tables. Velvet-lined booths stretched along the windows, offering breathtaking views of the snowy Alaskan wilderness. And yet, the passengers weren't right. There were about a dozen of them, scattered across the car, but something about them made my skin prickle. Their movements were too precise, too deliberate. Some sat sipping tea, others stirring their food in slow, rhythmic motions. A woman in a deep green dress sat at the far end of the car, staring out the window without blinking. I walked cautiously toward an empty table, my hands curled into fists at my sides. The moment I slid into my seat, a waiter in a crisp uniform appeared at my side, seemingly out of nowhere. His expression was neutral. Too neutral. "What can I get for you, Miss Ivanov?" I flinched. He knew my name. I forced a tight smile. "Just coffee." He nodded and disappeared before I could ask how he knew me. I exhaled shakily, my eyes flicking across the room. None of the other passengers looked at me directly, but I could feel their attention on me, lingering like a shadow just beyond my vision. I turned my gaze to the window instead, watching the endless white landscape blur past. The train cut through the wilderness like a phantom, the outside world distant and untouched. For a moment, I let myself breathe. Then, I saw the reflection, the man who shouldn't be there. In the window's glass, between the shimmering northern lights, someone was sitting across from me. My body went ice cold. I didn't move, didn't blink, because I hadn't heard anyone sit down. Slowly, so slowly, I shifted my gaze downward, toward the table. My hands trembled as I clenched them into fists beneath the tablecloth. I could see him now just barely, in my periphery. A man, dressed in a tattered grey suit. Pale, too pale. His skin had a sickly bluish tint, like frostbite creeping through his veins. His lips were cracked, and his eyes, black endless pits, were locked onto mine. A voice screamed inside my head, "Don't acknowledge him." My pulse pounded in my ears. Rule number 4, if you see someone in your cabin who shouldn't be there, do not acknowledge them. But this wasn't my cabin. Did the rule still apply? My breathing grew shallow as the man in the reflection leaned forward. His mouth moved, whispering something I couldn't hear over the train's low hum. My hands shook as I reached for my coffee cup, trying to act normal, trying to ignore him. But then, his hand moved across the table and grabbed my wrist. I felt it. The touch was wrong, ice-cold, brittle, like the fingers of a corpse frozen in the snow. My stomach twisted as every instinct screamed at me to look at him, to acknowledge that he was real. The waiter suddenly reappeared beside me, and the contact broke. "Is something wrong, Miss Ivanov?" I gasped, yanking my hand to my chest. The man in the reflection was gone. The seat across from me was empty. I looked up at the waiter, struggling to catch my breath. Who was just sitting here?" I rasped. His expression didn't change. "No one, miss. You've been alone." A chill slithered down my spine. I glanced at the passengers again. They weren't eating. They weren't really doing anything at all, just going through the motions, like puppets on invisible strings. I suddenly wasn't hungry anymore. I pushed back from the table, mumbling a quick, "Excuse me," before stumbling toward the exit. As I stepped into the next car, I heard it, a soft, ghostly whisper. "You shouldn't be here." The rule breaker. The hallway outside the dining car was just as empty as before, but my skin crawled. My steps were hurried now, my mind racing. Who was the man in the reflection? Had I broken a rule by acknowledging him? I needed answers. The only person who might have them was the conductor. I moved quickly, heading toward the front of the train, past doors marked private. The golden light in the corridor flickered slightly as I passed through, the train humming beneath my feet. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped. The footsteps stopped too. I turned my head slowly. The corridor was empty. The back of my neck prickled. I turned forward again, only to slam straight into someone. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching. It was a young man, maybe in his mid-20s, dressed in a heavy coat and scarf. His dark hair was tousled, and his eyes, real, human eyes, were filled with urgency. "You're new," he said breathlessly. "Listen to me. You broke a rule, didn't you?" My blood turned to ice. It's coming for you." I felt the train lurch slightly, like something heavy had just stepped on board. Something big. The chandeliers flickered, casting eerie shadows across the corridor walls. The air grew thick, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. The young man grabbed my wrist, pulling me forward. "There's no time. If you don't hide, it's going to—" The lights went out. Total darkness. And then a low guttural growl echoed through the train. Something was here, something that wasn't human. The train plunged into blackness. The chandeliers above us flickered once, twice, before their golden glow vanished completely, leaving only an abyss of shadows. And in that abyss, something breathed. Low, deep, wrong. It wasn't the sound of a person gasping for air. It was heavier, wet. A guttural, hungry noise that sent every nerve in my body into a state of sheer panic. The young man's grip on my wrist tightened. "Run." I didn't question him. I ran. We sprinted down the corridor, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The train's walls seemed to close in around us, the dim glow from the windows barely enough to light the way. The outside world was still a blur of white and green auroras, but inside was something else entirely. Something behind us. I didn't dare look back. The air shifted, and suddenly the corridor was filled with the sound of crawling. Not footsteps, crawling, long scraping movements, like nails dragging against the walls. The noise was impossibly fast, faster than we were running. It was getting closer. My lungs burned, my heart a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. Where are we going?" I gasped, my legs already aching from the sprint. "The storage car," he hissed. "If we can lock ourselves in—" A deep, bone-rattling growl cut through the air, so close it felt like it was inside my head. The young man yanked open a door at the end of the hallway, shoving me inside just as something slammed into the wall behind us. I caught a glimpse, just a glimpse, of a shadow too large to belong to anything human. Then the door slammed shut. Darkness. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the cold wooden crates stacked in the storage car. The young man was beside me, his breath ragged, his eyes wide with fear. Something was outside the door. The wood groaned, the metal hinges rattling under an impossible weight. A single elongated scratch dragged itself down the door. Then, a whisper. "Catherine." I choked on my own breath. It knew my name, again. The young man pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes silently pleading, "Don't make a sound." The scratching stopped. Silence. Seconds crawled by like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the presence outside the door vanished. We waited. 5 minutes, 10. Neither of us moved, barely even breathed. Finally, the young man let out a shuddering breath and sank to the floor. I followed, my hands trembling so badly I had to clutch my knees to keep them still. "What?" I swallowed, my throat dry. "What the hell was that?" The young man ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I don't know what it is. But it comes when someone breaks a rule." I flinched. I had broken a rule. Rule number 4, if you see someone in your cabin who shouldn't be there, do not acknowledge them. The man in the reflection. I had looked at him, and now something was hunting me for it. The truth about the train, for a long moment, neither of us spoke. I studied the young man, his tired eyes, his tense posture. He looked like someone who had been running for a long time. "You knew I broke a rule," I finally said. "How?" His expression darkened. "Because I did the same thing my first night." A cold wave of dread washed over me. "How long have you been on this train?" He hesitated. "Too long." Finally, he exhaled and said, "I don't know anymore." The train let out a low whistle, a haunting sound that sent a fresh chill down my spine. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Where does this train go? What is it?" The young man leaned his head back against the crate, his eyes unreadable. I think, he hesitated, I think this train moves through more than one place. More than just Alaska. More than just the world we know. I shivered. My father had told me this train was real, that the rules mattered, but he hadn't told me it was a trap. The conductor's warning, we couldn't stay in the storage car forever. Eventually, we crept back into the corridor, careful to listen for any sounds. The train had settled into an eerie quiet, as if nothing had happened. As if we hadn't just been chased by something inhuman. We needed answers. We needed to find the conductor. The young man, who finally introduced himself as Daniel, led the way toward the front of the train. We passed through multiple cars, each one as elegant and eerily still as the last. Then we reached a door labeled Conductor's Quarters. Daniel hesitated. You sure about this? No, I admitted, but I need to know what's going on. I knocked. The door creaked open on its own. The conductor was standing inside, his back to us, facing a large, ancient-looking map pinned to the wall. The map wasn't of Alaska. It wasn't of Earth. The land masses were wrong, shifting, swirling, like ink dissolving in water. Without turning around, the conductor spoke. You shouldn't have broken the rule, Miss Ivanov. His voice was calm, too calm. I swallowed. What happens now? He finally turned to face us. His dark eyes held no warmth, no anger, just acceptance. Now, he exhaled, now you have to survive the rest of the journey. A wave of cold terror spread through me. Daniel tensed beside me. And if she doesn't? The conductor's expression didn't change. Then the train will take her. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had 7 nights on this train. I had already broken a rule on my first, and if I didn't follow every single rule from now on, I wouldn't be leaving the Aurora Express alive. A thick silence settled in the conductor's quarters, heavy as the snow piling outside the windows. The dim lanterns cast flickering shadows across his face, deepening the tired lines around his eyes. I swallowed, my mouth dry. What do you mean the train will take me? The conductor studied me for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned back to the map pinned to the wall. This train doesn't just follow one track, he said. His voice was calm, but there was something buried beneath it. Something old, something resigned. I stepped closer, my gaze tracing the shifting land masses on the map. They were wrong, flickering between different shapes, like they couldn't decide what they were supposed to be. This isn't a normal train, Miss Ivanov. The Aurora Express moves through places beyond your understanding, beyond life and death. A cold prickle spread down my spine. Daniel crossed his arms. Then why are there rules? If this train is so unexplainable, why the rituals, the numbers, the warnings? The conductor finally looked at him. Because rules are the only thing keeping the passengers from being claimed. Claimed by what? I asked, barely above a whisper. The conductor sighed. By the train itself. The words settled in my bones like ice. I had been right to fear this place. This wasn't just a train. It was something alive, something hungry. I licked my lips, my pulse hammering. And the thing that chased us in the dark. His eyes darkened. A collector. I flinched. The conductor leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. The train follows rules, and so do they. If you break a rule, they come. Some passengers disappear within a day, others last a little longer. His gaze locked onto mine. But in the end, if you don't obey, the train will take you. A deep sinking feeling coiled in my gut. My father had never told me any of this. He had warned me about the rules, yes, but he hadn't said what happened if I broke them. Had he known, or had he hidden the truth from me on purpose? Daniel shifted uneasily beside me. How do we get off this thing? The conductor studied us both, then sighed. That depends on whether or not you survive the next 6 nights. The ghost at the window. The weight of his words followed us back through the train. Neither of us spoke as we returned to the passenger cars. My head was spinning, my thoughts tangled into a suffocating knot of fear and confusion. I had 7 nights on this train. I had already broken a rule on the first night. And now something was watching me, waiting for me to make another mistake. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. Jesus, what the hell did we get ourselves into? I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure there was an answer. Instead, I turned my gaze to the window beside us. The snow-covered wilderness blurred past in an endless swirl of white. The auroras shimmered in eerie greens and blues, casting ghostly reflections against the glass. And then, something moved. A shape just outside the train. I stiffened. It was there for only a second. A shadowy figure running alongside the train, its arms outstretched, reaching for me. I inhaled sharply, my breath fogging against the glass. It was gone. The night swallowed it whole, but deep in my gut, I knew it hadn't left. It was still there, somewhere in the dark. Waiting. The third rule, I locked my cabin door that night, twice. The weight of exhaustion dragged me under, but even as I lay curled beneath the heavy blankets, sleep refused to come. Because I knew something was out there. Something was watching. The train creaked and groaned as it moved through the night, the sounds unnervingly human-like. Whispers slithered through the walls, muffled voices that didn't belong to any passenger I had seen. At some point, I must have drifted into a half-conscious haze, because I didn't hear the knocking at first. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate knock against the wood of my cabin door. My eyes flew open, my breath caught in my throat. Tap, tap, tap. I shot upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. The knocking was too soft, too patient. And then, a voice. Low, sweet, familiar. Catherine. I felt my stomach drop, because I knew that voice. It was my father's. I froze. The sound of his voice, so gentle, so warm, sent a wave of conflicting emotions through me. My father was gone, dead, buried, and yet he was standing on the other side of my door. I squeezed my eyes shut, my fingers curling into the blankets. Rule number 3. No matter what you hear at night, do not open your cabin door. Do not open your cabin door. The knocking continued, more insistent now. Catherine, sweetheart, my father's voice called again. It's me. Open the door. A lump formed in my throat. It sounded exactly like him. The way he used to speak to me when I was a child, the same tenderness, the same steady rhythm. My body screamed to listen, to obey, but my gut told me the truth. This wasn't my father. I squeezed my hands into fists. You're not real. A long silence. Then, a low, wet chuckle. The voice changed, twisted, warped into something else, something wrong. Smart girl, the thing outside the door rasped. The knocking stopped, and the temperature in my cabin plummeted. I curled deeper into the blankets, every muscle in my body rigid with fear. Outside, the train continued its lonely journey through the Alaskan wilderness, and I knew, without a doubt, I had almost made another fatal mistake. Morning comes with a warning. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By the time the first pale glow of morning crept through my window, my body was stiff, my nerves frayed to their very edges. A slip of paper had been slid under my door. I hesitated before picking it up. There were only 4 words scrawled across it, written in an unfamiliar hand. Do not break more. My hands trembled. 6 nights remained, and I wasn't sure if I'd make it to the end. The note burned in my hands. Do not break more. The words were hastily scrawled, the ink slightly smudged. Whoever wrote this, they knew. They knew I had already broken the rules. And they were warning me. A fresh wave of dread curled in my stomach. I shoved the note into my pocket and forced myself to move. Lying here, alone in my cabin, wasn't an option. If I stayed too long, my mind would start tricking me, convincing me to open the door again, convincing me that maybe, just maybe, my father's voice had been real. But I knew better now. I had to. A stranger in the dining car. When I stepped into the dining car, it was eerily quiet. Passengers were scattered throughout, sipping coffee, stirring oatmeal, speaking in hushed tones. The golden chandeliers flickered dimly, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. Daniel sat in a corner, his face pale, dark circles rimming his eyes. I slid into the seat across from him. You look like hell, he muttered. I let out a weak laugh. Yeah? Well, hell has a lovely view of the northern lights. Daniel didn't smile. His fingers drummed against the table. Did something happen last night? I hesitated, then told him. About the knocking, the voice that sounded like my father, the note under my door. By the time I finished, his expression had darkened. This train, he muttered, shaking his head. It wants to break you. It wants you to slip up. I exhaled shakily. I know. A clatter of silverware made me jump. Across the room, a woman had dropped her spoon into her oatmeal. But it wasn't the sound that made my blood run cold. It was her face. She was staring directly at me. Her eyes were too wide, unblinking, her mouth slightly open as if frozen mid-sentence. Her skin looked wrong, almost like porcelain, too smooth, too still. I gripped the edge of the table. Daniel. He followed my gaze. His body stiffened. The woman still didn't move, not even to breathe. And then, she smiled, slow, too slow, a creeping, unnatural grin that stretched her lips too far, exposing teeth that were too perfect, too identical, like they had been carved from bone. A feeling of absolute wrongness spread through me. Daniel grabbed my wrist under the table. "Don't look at her," he muttered. My pulse spiked. "Why?" He didn't answer. His grip tightened. "Just look at me." I forced my gaze away from her, locking onto Daniel instead. His expression was tense, his jaw tight. The weight of her stare burned into the side of my face. I could feel her watching me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the feeling vanished. Daniel let out a slow breath. "She's gone." I risked a glance. The woman was still there, but now she was eating her oatmeal again, her motions slow and mechanical, as if nothing had happened. A cold sweat prickled along my spine. "Daniel," I whispered. "Who the hell was that?" He swallowed. "I don't know." The fifth rule. We left the dining car quickly after that. Neither of us spoke as we made our way down the corridor, but I could tell we were both thinking the same thing. Something about this train was changing. Or maybe it was testing us. Daniel broke the silence. "You said you got a note, right?" I nodded, pulling it from my pocket. He took it, scanning the 4 simple words with a frown. "Who do you think wrote it?" I asked. He exhaled. "Someone who's been here longer than us." A shiver ran through me. We passed by a set of closed curtains. I barely noticed them at first, until Daniel grabbed my arm and pulled me back. I stiffened. "What?" He pointed to the fabric. "Look closely." I did, and that's when I saw it. A shadow standing behind the curtains. Tall, motionless, completely silent. A jolt of pure terror shot through me. "There's—" My voice caught in my throat. "Shh," Daniel warned. My heart pounded. "What the hell is that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another note. It was old, yellowed. The handwriting different from mine. There was only one sentence. Rule number 5. If you see a closed curtain, do not open it. A chill wrapped around me like a vice. We kept walking. Neither of us looked back, but I swore, just before we turned the corner, I saw the shadow move. The forgotten passenger. By the time we reached the next car, my nerves were completely shot. "We need more answers," I muttered. Daniel hesitated. "From who?" I looked ahead. The next car wasn't like the others. The lights were dimmer, the wood older. The air itself felt heavier, like stepping into a room where someone had been waiting for a very long time. A small plaque was nailed to the door. "Passengers from previous journeys." My throat went dry. Daniel gave me a wary look. "I don't like this." "Me neither," I admitted. "But if someone's been on this train longer than us, maybe they can tell us how to survive." I reached for the handle. The door creaked open. Inside was a row of seats, lined up like a waiting room. And in those seats, people. Or at least I thought they were people at first. Their clothes were old, outdated, like they had stepped out of the past. Their skin was pale, almost greyish. Their eyes were wrong, unfocused, vacant. A sick, twisting feeling coiled in my gut. Something was wrong with them. Daniel exhaled slowly. I think they've been here too long." A man in the front row suddenly twitched. I froze. His head turned toward me, slow, unnatural. His lips cracked open. "You shouldn't be here." The words came out in a dry rasp, like something long dead trying to remember speech. Daniel grabbed my hand. "We need to go. Now. The passengers started to rise from their seats, one by one, too slow, too wrong, and their eyes were locked onto us. We ran. I didn't look back, but I heard them, whispering, "The train will take you. The train will take you. The train will take you." We slammed the door shut behind us, and I swore, somewhere deep inside that cursed car, someone laughed. The door slammed shut behind us. Daniel and I stood in the narrow corridor gasping for breath. The air was thick, suffocating. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else, but I knew they were still behind that door, watching, waiting. A low, dry whisper slid through the cracks in the wood. "The train will take you." A chill curled through my spine. Daniel grabbed my wrist and pulled me away. "Come on, we need to get out of here." I didn't argue. We rushed through the next set of doors, putting as much distance between ourselves and that room full of forgotten passengers as possible. But as we moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Something unseen. Something waiting for us to make another mistake. The conductor's warning. We didn't stop moving until we reached the conductor's quarters. Daniel banged on the door. "Open up." A long silence, then the sound of locks clicking open. The conductor stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. He looked at us once, then sighed. "You saw them, didn't you?" I swallowed hard. Who are they?" His grip tightened on the door. "Passengers who broke the rules." The words settled in my gut like lead. Daniel's jaw clenched. "So they're, what, stuck here?" The conductor's eyes flickered toward the floor. "Yes." A horrible silence followed. I felt sick. Those people, those things, they had once been like us, alive, aware. But the train had taken them. Daniel crossed his arms. "Then how do we get out?" The conductor's gaze snapped to him. "You don't break any more rules." His words were sharp. Final. He stepped aside, motioning for us to enter. We followed him inside, the door clicking shut behind us. For the first time, I noticed how exhausted he looked, like he hadn't slept in years. Or maybe he hadn't. The thought made my stomach twist. He gestured to a large map pinned to the wall. "You have 6 more nights. If you follow the rules, you'll get to the final stop. From there, you'll be able to leave." I exhaled shakily. "And if we don't?" His face darkened. "Then you won't leave at all." A heavy silence fell between us. I glanced at the map. The route was impossible to follow, shifting constantly, as if the train itself didn't know where it was going. Daniel rubbed his temples. "There has to be a way to escape sooner." The conductor's expression turned grim. "Do not try to leave before the 7th night." His voice carried an unshakable weight, the kind of warning that meant something far worse than death awaited us if we ignored it. Then, slowly, he picked up a small, tattered notebook from his desk and handed it to me. "These are the rest of the rules." My breath caught in my throat. Daniel took a step closer. "Why are you giving this to us now?" The conductor's fingers twitched at his sides. "Because from this night onward, the train will try harder to break you." My stomach turned to ice. I looked down at the notebook in my hands. The cover was old, worn with age. Faint handwriting was scrawled across it. "Survival rules do not ignore." My fingers trembled as I flipped to the first new rule. Rule number 6. If you hear a whisper in the dark, do not reply. A lump formed in my throat. Daniel and I exchanged a look. The conductor's voice was quiet, grave. "The train knows you now, and it will start calling your name." Something in the air vents. We left the conductor's quarters with the notebook clutched tightly in my hands. Neither of us spoke as we made our way back toward our cabins. The weight of the new rule pressed down on my chest, heavy and suffocating. If you hear a whisper in the dark, do not reply. I hated how specific it was. I hated that it meant someone, or something, was going to try and talk to me. We reached my cabin door first. I hesitated. Daniel frowned. "What is it?" I hesitated, then whispered, "I don't want to sleep alone." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Yeah, me neither." We stood there in silence. Then slowly he reached for my door handle and froze. His entire body went rigid. I felt the air shift. A cold breeze slipped past us, carrying with it the faintest sound, a whisper, software, just beneath hearing. My body locked up. Daniel didn't move, didn't breathe. The whispering continued, faint, persistent. It was coming from the air vent above my door, a slow, rasping voice. Catherine. The sound slithered through the metal like rotting silk. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stop myself from making a sound. Daniel's grip on my arm tightened. His face was pale, his eyes wide. We both knew the rule. Do not reply. The whispering grew softer, more urgent. You're not supposed to be here. Every inch of my skin crawled. My fingers ached from gripping my notebook too tightly. Don't trust the conductor. I felt the breath leave my lungs. The whisper stopped. The silence was worse. I could feel something waiting on the other side of the vent, something that wanted me to answer. Daniel slowly backed away, tugging me with him. His voice was barely a breath. Get inside. Lock your door. I nodded quickly. We separated, slipping into our cabins without another word. I locked my door. Twice. Then I pressed my back against it, my pulse hammering. The train groaned as it moved through the darkness, and somewhere deep in the vents, something shifted. Waiting. Listening. Testing me. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding. 6 more nights. Could I survive that long? I barely slept that night. Even with my cabin door locked, even with the blanket pulled over my head like a child hiding from a nightmare, I could still feel something in the vents. Listening. Waiting. At some point, exhaustion finally won. My body shut down and I slipped into uneasy sleep. But the dreams were worse. I dreamt of the forgotten passengers, their vacant eyes locked onto mine, their voices melted together in a horrible chant, their whispers slipping through my skull like worms burrowing into soft soil. The train will take you. The train will take you. The train will take you. When I woke, I felt no relief, because I wasn't sure if the whispering had only been in my dreams. Daniel's discovery. The morning light, if I could even call it that, was dim and grey, filtering weakly through the frosted window. The train was still moving, endless and unstoppable, cutting through the Alaskan wilderness. I forced myself up, stretching sore limbs, and cautiously opened my cabin door. Daniel was already waiting for me. His face was pale, his expression grim. I knew immediately that something was wrong. I found something, he muttered. I swallowed hard. Good or bad? His jaw tightened. Just, come see. He led me down the corridor, past several empty cabins, past the dining car, until we stopped outside a restroom. I frowned. What are we doing here? Daniel didn't answer. He just pushed the door open. I stepped inside, my confusion growing. It was just a normal train restroom, a bit cramped, cold metal walls, a mirror above the sink. The light flickered weakly overhead. And then I saw it. The mirror. At first I thought my reflection looked normal, but as I stepped closer, my stomach dropped. The reflection of the cabin behind me was wrong. The door in the mirror was slightly open, even though the real door behind me was shut. And in that tiny gap, a hand was reaching through, pale, bony, too long. My pulse spiked. Daniel. I know. His voice was tight. Watch this. He stepped forward, lifting a hand to touch the mirror. His reflection did the same, but the door behind him in the mirror opened even wider. I gasped. Stop. He pulled his hand back. The reflection snapped back to normal, except now I could swear the thing behind the door was closer. Watching. I turned to look at the actual door. It was still shut. My breath came fast and shallow. There's something inside the reflections, Daniel muttered. I noticed it this morning. I swallowed hard. Is it watching us? His silence was my answer. I turned back to the mirror, my hands trembling. A thought struck me. What if, I hesitated, what if this is another rule? Daniel's brow furrowed. What do you mean? I pulled the notebook from my pocket, flipping through the pages until I found what I was looking for. Rule number 7, do not trust the reflections. They do not belong to you. The words burned into my brain. I turned back to the mirror and froze. The thing behind the door was gone. Daniel saw it too. His entire body stiffened. Where did it go? A chill wrapped around my spine. I didn't want to find out. "Let's go," I whispered. We left the restroom quickly, my heart hammering in my chest, but as we walked back toward our cabins, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from every reflective surface. The passenger without a face. By the time we reached the dining car, my nerves were completely shot. We slid into a booth near the window. The scenery outside was still a never-ending expanse of white, the northern lights casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Daniel tapped his fingers against the table. "What do you think it wants?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but the fact that it can move—" I hesitated, my stomach twisting. "I think it's trying to get out." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Then we make sure it doesn't." A sharp clatter made me jump. A woman across the dining car had dropped her fork. Her head was bent forward, her hair covering her face. But something about her posture felt wrong, like a puppet with its strings suddenly cut. Then slowly, she lifted her head. My breath caught in my throat. She had no face, just smooth, pale skin where her features should have been. Daniel's entire body tensed. "Don't move." I sat frozen, horrified. The woman, or whatever she was, tilted her head as if listening to something we couldn't hear. Then, in a slow, jerky movement, she stood up. I gripped the edge of the table. "Daniel, don't talk." His voice was barely a breath. The faceless woman took a step forward, then another. My pulse pounded in my ears. She was walking directly toward us. Every instinct in my body screamed, "Run!" But I couldn't move. She stopped right beside our table. Then slowly, she turned her head toward me. I felt a cold, unnatural pressure against my chest, like something pressing into my soul, peeling it apart layer by layer. And then she spoke. But it wasn't a voice. It was a whisper, faint, echoing. "Catherine." The same voice from the vents. My vision swam. Daniel reached under the table and grabbed my hand, squeezing hard. A warning, "Doctor, not reply." I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. The faceless woman stood there, unmoving. The entire dining car felt trapped in frozen time. Then, just as suddenly as she had come, she turned and walked away. My body slumped forward as tension rushed out of me. Daniel's grip finally loosened. We sat there, not speaking, not even breathing too loudly, until she disappeared into the next car. Only then did Daniel speak. "This train wants to break you," he whispered. "It wants you to give in." I swallowed hard. "Then we don't let it." His eyes met mine. Something unspoken passed between us. I didn't know if we were strong enough, but we had no choice. 6 more nights, and the train was just getting started. The encounter with the faceless woman left me rattled, but there was no time to process it. The train had a way of pushing forward, pulling us deeper into its web of horrors, whether we were ready or not. Daniel and I sat in silence for a long time after she left, both of us too shaken to speak. Then finally he exhaled and ran a hand down his face. "We need to figure out what the hell is going on." I nodded, still gripping the notebook like a lifeline. The rules had saved us so far, but I was starting to feel like they weren't just guidelines. They were warnings left behind by someone who had been in our place before, someone who might not have made it out. I flipped through the pages, scanning ahead. There were more rules we hadn't encountered yet, but one stood out immediately. Rule number 8. Do not wake the sleepers. If they wake on their own, do not meet their gaze. My stomach twisted. Daniel must have seen the look on my face because he leaned closer. "What is it?" I turned the notebook toward him, his expression darkened. "Great. Another nightmare to look forward to." A thought gnawed at the edges of my mind. What if the woman back there was a sleeper? Daniel frowned. She was awake, though. I shivered. Maybe that's the problem. Neither of us wanted to linger in the dining car any longer, so we decided to move. The atmosphere felt charged, like something else was waiting to happen. As we made our way back toward our cabins, I couldn't help but glance at every sleeping passenger we passed. Were they normal? Were they dreaming? Or were they waiting to wake up? The man with the open eyes. We reached my cabin first. I hesitated before opening the door, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing down on me. Daniel nudged my arm. "Get some rest. I'll be right next door." I forced a nod, but the idea of sleeping alone sent chills through me. Still, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. Something was wrong immediately. The air was different, heavy, suffocating. I turned slowly, and my blood turned to ice. There was someone in my bed. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was the way the blankets were bunched up. Maybe I was overtired. But then, the covers shifted. I took a step back, heart hammering. And then I saw him. A man was lying in my bed, fully clothed, his hands folded over his chest like a corpse in a coffin. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, unblinking. My breath caught in my throat. I felt like I was staring at a wax figure, something too still, too unnatural. My mind screamed at me to run, but then I remembered the rule. Do not wake the sleepers. If they wake on their own, do not meet their gaze. Oh God. I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to move too quickly. He wasn't awake. Not yet. I reached behind me, fumbling blindly for the door handle. My fingers finally found it. Click. I slipped out into the hallway, my breath ragged. Daniel noticed immediately. What happened? I grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the door. Someone's in my bed. His eyes widened. What? I don't know who he is, but he's sleeping. Daniel tensed. The rule. I nodded, my pulse still racing. We can't wake him up. And if he wakes up on his own... We don't look at him. Daniel finished. A horrible silence fell between us. Then, very softly, I heard it. The sound of sheets rustling inside my cabin. My stomach turned. Daniel grabbed my wrist. We need to go. Now. We hurried down the corridor, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and the man in my bed. But no matter how far we went, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had woken up, and that he knew we were running. The door that shouldn't exist. We kept walking, trying to find anywhere safe to regroup. The train cars stretched on endlessly, feeling longer than they should. We passed through another set of doors, expecting to enter a familiar car, maybe another hallway or a seating area. But instead, we stepped into something completely different. A long, narrow corridor. No seats, no windows. Just a single black door at the very end. I stopped short. Daniel did too. What the hell is this? He murmured. I shook my head. I don't know. The train had changed again. The door at the end of the hallway looked old, almost ancient. The paint was peeling, and something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. A small plaque was bolted to the door, covered in dust. I stepped closer, heart pounding, and wiped the dust away. There was a name carved into the metal. Passengers who failed. I felt my stomach drop. Daniel grabbed my arm. We're not opening that. I nodded quickly, but as we turned to leave, the train lurched violently. The lights flickered out, and then, from behind the black door, knocking. Slow, methodical, the air turned ice cold, then a voice, faint, weak, desperate. Please, help us. I felt my body lock up. Daniel's grip on me tightened. The knocking became more frantic. Let us out. Please, we don't belong here. I clenched my jaw. It sounded so human, so real. But I knew better now. The train was testing us. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. We don't open it. I forced myself to nod. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was so much worse. I felt something shift behind the door, something waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the lights flickered back on. The corridor was gone. We were standing in a normal train car again, as if none of it had happened. I exhaled shakily. Daniel ran a hand down his face. I hate this fucking train. I couldn't argue with him. The train is changing. As we made our way back to safer ground, I flipped through the notebook, looking for more answers. The train wasn't just haunted. It was shifting, changing, testing us. And I was starting to wonder, had anyone ever made it to the final stop? Or were we just playing a game that had no real winners? One thing was becoming clearer with each passing hour. The train wasn't just full of ghosts, it was alive, and it was getting hungrier. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Daniel. Every creak of the train, every distant whisper in the vents kept us on edge, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. The man in my cabin, the sleeper, was still in there. I didn't know if he had woken up yet, and I didn't want to find out. So we sat in the dim glow of the train's hallway, whispering theories, piecing together what we could. But the more we tried to understand the train, the more it felt like we were slipping further out of reality. This place wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was changing us. The conductor appears. At some point, Daniel nudged my shoulder, nodding toward the far end of the corridor. Someone was walking toward us. At first, I thought it was another passenger, but then I saw the dark uniform. The cap pulled low over his face. The conductor. My throat tightened. We had seen him once before, when he gave the announcement on the first night. But no one had seen him up close. Not until now. He moved with an unnatural stillness, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. When he reached us, he stopped. "You are not where you should be." His voice was flat, emotionless. I swallowed hard. "What?" His head tilted slightly. "Passengers should remain in their assigned cabins at night." I glanced at Daniel. He was as tense as I was. There was someone in my room," I admitted, choosing my words carefully. "A sleeper." The conductor didn't react. He just stared at us, silent, waiting. Daniel cleared his throat. "We didn't wake him. We followed the rules." Finally, the conductor moved. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal ticket puncher. Snip, snip. The sound was uncomfortably loud in the quiet hallway. Then, without another word, he turned and began walking away. But just before he disappeared into the next car, he paused. The train does not like disobedience. And then he was gone. The air felt heavier after he left, like the train itself had been listening to our conversation. I turned to Daniel. "What the hell was that?" His jaw was tight. "I don't know." But we both knew something was wrong. The conductor's voice, his movements. He wasn't human. Not anymore. The car that shouldn't exist. We needed answers. I wasn't content to just survive. I needed to understand. The notebook, the rules, the shifting corridors. This train was following a pattern, but we were missing something. And the best way to get answers? Find where the conductor goes when no one is looking. We waited until the train was at its quietest, the passengers either asleep or locked away in their rooms. Then we moved. Through the corridors, past the empty dining car, past the mirror-lined restroom, which I refused to look at. And then we found it. A door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Daniel gave me a look. "You sure about this?" I wasn't. But I nodded anyway. He pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The forgotten car. The first thing I noticed was the smell. The air was stale, thick with dust, and something that smelled rotted. It was a storage car, or at least it had been once. Now it was filled with rows of abandoned luggage, stacked haphazardly. Some of the suitcases looked old, covered in a thick layer of dust, like they had been here for decades. I swallowed. How many people never got off this train? Daniel didn't answer. He was staring at something further inside the car. A desk. At first it seemed out of place among the piles of forgotten luggage. But then I saw the papers stacked neatly on its surface. Passenger manifests, train schedules, and my stomach turned to ice. A notebook, identical to the one in my pocket. Daniel picked it up and flipped it open. His face paled. "Catherine, look at the first page." I leaned in, heart hammering. There was a list of names written inside. Some had been crossed out, a lot of them. But at the very bottom of the list, in shaky handwriting, Catherine Ivanov, Daniel Graves. My head spun. What does this mean?" I whispered. Daniel's fingers clenched around the notebook. "It means we aren't the first ones to go through this." My stomach twisted. I flipped to the back pages, desperate for more information. And then, one sentence, scribbled over and over again, filling an entire page. "Do not let the conductor punch your ticket." My blood ran cold. Snip, snip. The sound echoed in my head. Daniel and I looked at each other, the same realization dawning. The conductor hadn't spoken to us out of concern. He had come to mark us. I reached into my coat pocket, fingers trembling, and pulled out my ticket. The paper was pristine, except for the top corner where the conductor had punched a hole through it. Daniel pulled his out too. His was the same. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. What happens when he punches it again? Daniel's face was grim. I don't think we want to find out. The weight of the past, I turned back to the passenger manifest on the desk. One by one, I scanned the names. Some were crossed out, others weren't. And then I found it. One name that stood out. J. Ivanov. My hands shook. My father's name. Daniel's eyes widened. Catherine. I snapped the book shut. My father had been on this train, and if his name was in here, it meant he hadn't just disappeared into the storm like everyone believed. The train had taken him, and if we weren't careful, it would take us too. The next stop approaches. A distant whistle echoed through the train. The speakers crackled to life with the conductor's voice. Next stop approaching. Prepare yourselves. My stomach clenched. Daniel exhaled sharply. We need to get off this train. I nodded. But we need to do it before our tickets are punched again. Because now, I was sure, the train wasn't taking us to a destination, it was taking us to our final stop. And we were running out of time. The weight of the discovery settled over me like a suffocating fog. My father had been on this train, and now so were we. Daniel and I stood frozen in the dimly lit storage car, the flickering overhead lights casting long, unnatural shadows over the piles of forgotten luggage. The passenger manifest lay open before us, my father's name written among dozens, hundreds of others. Some crossed out, some still intact. And then there was the notebook. The desperate warning scrawled across the last page rang in my skull like a funeral bell. Do not let the conductor punch your ticket. My stomach twisted violently. I pulled my ticket from my pocket again, staring at the small circular hole that the conductor had punched through the corner. 1 mark. How many more before I was crossed off that list? Daniel took a shaky breath. We need to get off this train. I nodded. Before it's too late. But something deep inside me knew the truth. This wasn't a normal train ride. There were no normal stops. The train didn't let people leave, not unless it was done with them. And by then, it was already too late. The sleeper has awakened. A distant sound made me flinch, a low, dragging noise, like something heavy sliding across the floor. It was coming from outside the storage car. Daniel tensed. Someone's coming. We quickly extinguished our flashlight and ducked behind a row of suitcases, pressing ourselves into the shadows. The noise grew louder. The door to the storage car creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. I clenched my teeth to keep from making a sound. It was a man. Tall, thin, moving with a slow, unnatural stiffness, like his limbs weren't entirely his own. His head tilted unnaturally to one side, his neck bent at a sickening angle. And then I saw his eyes, wide open, unblinking. I sucked in a silent breath, the sleeper from my cabin. But he wasn't sleeping anymore. Daniel's grip tightened on my arm. I knew the rule. If they wake on their own, do not meet their gaze. I tore my eyes away, staring at the dusty floor beneath us. My pulse hammered in my ears. The dragging noise continued, his feet scraping against the floor as he moved further into the storage car. Then he stopped. The air grew unbearably still. I felt him standing right in front of us. I squeezed my eyes shut. For a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. And then he spoke, a garbled, broken whisper. They don't let you leave. A wave of ice crawled down my spine. His voice sounded wrong, like it had been scraped raw, used too many times in ways it wasn't meant to be. He shifted. I held my breath. They took my ticket, punched it 3 times. Something wet dripped onto the floor near my hand. Then they put me back. To sleep. A shudder ran through my entire body. I wanted to scream, wanted to run. But I didn't. I didn't move. And after a long, agonizing moment, the sleeper turned and dragged himself out of the car. The door shut behind him. I let out a trembling breath. Daniel did the same. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then Daniel whispered, 3 punches. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. 1 punch had marked us. 2 more would seal our fate. A glimpse beyond the window. We couldn't stay in the storage car any longer. Carefully, we crept back into the corridor, glancing both ways before making our way toward the front of the train. We needed to find out where the conductor went. As we moved through the cars, I noticed something odd. The windows. At first, they were normal, dark, endless wilderness passing by. Snow-covered trees, icy mountains. But then they started to change. In one window, I saw a stretch of barren land, flat and dry, cracked like old skin. A sky that wasn't Alaska's sky, but a deep, angry red. In another, I saw black water, a vast, endless ocean where something huge stirred beneath the surface. And then, I stopped. One window showed something impossible. A room, not outside the train, inside it. A space we hadn't seen before. It was a dark chamber, filled with rows and rows of hanging bodies. Passengers, swaying gently, their heads bowed. And in the center, the conductor, standing perfectly still, his head slightly tilted, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. Daniel grabbed my wrist. "Come on." I tore my gaze away, but I could still feel the conductor's presence lingering behind my eyes. Watching, waiting. The next stop approaches. The train gave a sudden, violent lurch, nearly knocking us off our feet. The speakers crackled. Then, the conductor's voice. "Next stop approaching." My blood ran cold. I glanced at Daniel. His face had gone pale. I could hear the faint sounds of passengers stirring behind closed doors. Footsteps in the hall. The train was changing again. And I had the horrible feeling that whatever stop was coming, it wasn't one we were meant to leave. The last warning, we reached the next car, but something stopped us in our tracks. Another door, black, like the one we had seen before. A plaque hung above it, but this time it said something different. Passengers who tried to escape. My stomach twisted into knots. Daniel exhaled sharply. "We can't go in there." I agreed, but as I turned away, something scratched at the door from the other side, slow, desperate. "Don't let him punch your ticket." My throat tightened, then the sound of many voices whispering at once. "You're running out of time." A cold sweat broke out across my skin, and then silence. I turned to Daniel. "We need to find a way off this train." He nodded, face grim. "Before we're next." The whistle blew, long and haunting. The next stop was coming, and I had the terrible feeling that if we didn't figure out what was really happening soon, we wouldn't be on this train much longer, but we also wouldn't be getting off alive. The train whistle screamed through the corridors, a long, agonizing wail that made my teeth rattle. The next stop was approaching. But something felt wrong. Daniel and I clutched the metal bars near the hallway as the train shuddered violently, almost as if it was fighting itself, resisting the stop. I looked out the nearest window and felt my stomach drop. There was a station ahead, but it wasn't like the cozy, snow-covered Alaskan platforms I was used to. This station was wrong. A massive, gaping black void stretched where the tracks should have been, pulsing like a living thing. Instead of wooden beams or metal columns, the station seemed to be built from twisted bone, structures that curved and spiraled unnaturally into the air. The signs hanging from rusted posts were blank, flickering as though something were struggling to write on them. And on the platform, they stood waiting. A row of passengers, still, silent, their eyes completely black. I sucked in a shaky breath. "Daniel, this isn't a real station." His jaw clenched. "It's a stop, but not for us." The speakers crackled to life. "Now arriving." I heard the doors unlock with a sharp metallic click, and then from deeper inside the train, a soft but unmistakable sound. Snip, snip. The conductor was moving, punching more tickets, and I had the horrible feeling that anyone whose ticket had been punched 3 times wouldn't be on the train much longer. The marked ones, Daniel grabbed my wrist. "We can't just stand here. We need to move." We rushed down the corridor, pushing past doors, trying to avoid being seen. The train was different now. The walls seemed to pulse, the lights flickering in an erratic, rhythmic pattern, almost like the heartbeat of something enormous. We passed an open cabin, and for a split second, I saw a woman sitting on her bed, clutching her hands together in prayer. She had 2 holes in her ticket. She was next. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the marked passengers weren't running. They weren't fighting. They knew. Somehow they had accepted their fate, but I wasn't about to do the same. The conductor's collection. We made it to the next car, one we hadn't explored yet. I hesitated at the threshold. Something about it felt heavier, more final. But before I could turn back, Daniel stepped inside, and what we saw made my stomach twist into knots. It was a gallery, an entire room filled with glass cases, each one containing a single object: a child's shoe, a pair of rusted glasses, a folded note, its ink smeared with time. I moved closer to one of the cases. There was a ticket inside, and next to it a photograph. My breath caught in my throat. The picture showed a young man, barely in his 20s. His face was hollow, his eyes dark. There was something eerily familiar about him. Daniel stepped next to me, his face pale. "Catherine." He pointed to the plaque beneath the case. "J. Ivanov." I staggered backward. My father's name, my father's ticket. The train had kept it. I turned sharply toward the rest of the room, my heartbeat a deafening drum in my ears. Each case, each object. These weren't just forgotten items. They were remnants of the passengers who had been taken. A horrific collection. The conductor's collection. And if we didn't stop him, if we didn't find a way off this train, one day our belongings would be in these cases too. The third punch. A distant sound snapped me out of my thoughts. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. The conductor was coming. I turned to Daniel in a panic. "We have to hide." We darted toward the back of the gallery, crouching behind a row of cases, pressing ourselves into the shadows. The door creaked open. I held my breath. The conductor stepped inside. Even without looking directly at him, I could feel his presence, a weight, an unnatural stillness. And then, snip, snip. The sound of his puncher echoed through the room. He was marking someone. I chanced a glance toward the cases, looking at the reflections in the glass. A passenger stood frozen in the center of the room, staring straight ahead, trembling violently. Their hands were shaking as they held out their ticket. The conductor reached for it. And, snip, the third punch. The moment the hole was punched, the passenger let out a choked sob. Their body convulsing, their skin turning pale, their eyes rolled back. And then they collapsed into nothingness, like their body had simply ceased to exist. No blood, no sound. Just gone. The conductor stood still for a moment. Then slowly he turned toward the glass case beside him. A new object appeared inside. A wedding ring. I bit my lip hard enough to draw blood. The conductor was stealing something from each passenger he took. Their last, most personal possession. And then he moved again. Toward the door, toward the next marked passenger. I knew what I had to do. I turned to Daniel, my voice barely a whisper. "We have to destroy our tickets." His eyes widened. "What?" "The train marks us with the punches. It counts us. If we're not on its list, we won't be passengers anymore," he finished. I nodded, but then his face fell. "Catherine, what if that doesn't work?" I swallowed. I didn't know. But we were running out of options. The final stop. The speakers crackled again. The train lurched. Final stop approaching. Daniel's hand tightened around mine. We didn't have much time. We needed to destroy our tickets before the conductor came for us, before we were marked for the last time. I pulled mine from my pocket, and then I heard it. A voice, a whisper. Not from Daniel, not from the train, but from the case holding my father's ticket. "Catherine, don't let him punch it again." I froze. My father's voice, somewhere deep inside the train. The conductor was coming for us. And if we didn't act now, we wouldn't get another chance. My father's voice echoed in my head. "Catherine, don't let him punch it again." My fingers trembled as I gripped the ticket, its edges curling slightly with sweat. The train's final stop was approaching. We didn't have time to think. Did destroying the ticket really mean we'd be free? Or would it just erase us from existence, the same way the last passenger had vanished when their third punch was made? Daniel's face was pale, his own ticket clenched in his fist. "If we do this, there's no going back." I swallowed hard. "We're out of time." And then, the door creaked open. The conductor had arrived, the conductor's true form. The room darkened instantly, the air becoming thick and suffocating. It was like stepping into a vacuum, like all the warmth and life had been sucked out. I didn't dare look directly at him, but I saw his reflection in the glass cases. Tall, unnaturally thin. His uniform was no longer crisp and clean, it was rotting, frayed at the edges, the deep navy fabric seeming to shift like living shadows. His face, God, his face, it wasn't human anymore. Where his eyes should have been, there were two black voids, stretching far beyond where they belonged, like windows into something endless. His mouth, if you could even call it that, was a jagged line, splitting open in ways that no mouth should. He raised his puncher. Snip. A fresh hole appeared in another ticket, but I couldn't see who it belonged to. Daniel grabbed my arm. Now! With a surge of adrenaline, I tore my ticket in half. The moment I did, the entire train screamed. The sound wasn't coming from the speakers, nor from the conductor. It was coming from the train itself. A deep, inhuman wail that rattled the glass cases and made my bones feel like they were about to crack open. I gasped for breath as the ground lurched beneath us, the train shuddering violently. Daniel ripped his ticket apart right after mine, and then everything went still. The forgotten ones. The conductor stiffened, his black, empty eyes widened as if he had just realized something terrible. He took a step back. For the first time since we boarded, the conductor hesitated. The train didn't know what to do with us. Passengers followed the rules. They played the game, whether they knew it or not. But we had just broken the system. We weren't passengers anymore. We were something else, something the train hadn't accounted for. The cases around us began to change. Objects flickered in and out of existence like someone was frantically rewriting history. My father's ticket disappeared. The cases with names erased themselves. Passengers who had been taken, who had been marked, they were being erased from the train's memory. And if my father was erased, did that mean he had never been taken at all? I turned back toward the conductor, and I saw something I never expected. He was shrinking, his towering, grotesque form withered, his limbs trembling, his uniform falling apart into dust. Without our tickets, without our names on his manifest, he had no power over us anymore. We weren't part of his collection. We weren't part of the train, and neither was he. The final stop arrives. The train lurched again, this time in a way that felt different. It wasn't fighting anymore, it was letting us go. Outside the windows, the black void of the previous stop had vanished, replaced by a vast, endless white tundra, snow stretching for miles. A real station, a real exit. Daniel and I ran. The train cars began to shift, the walls folding in on themselves, seats and compartments collapsing as if the train were trying to swallow itself whole. Passengers, ones who had been asleep, ones who had vanished, began to reappear, stumbling into the halls, confused and dazed. Somehow, by breaking the rules, we had undone everything the train had done before us. The doors slammed open, revealing the station platform. Cold, real, solid ground. We didn't hesitate. We leapt out of the train just as it began to dissolve behind us, its once mighty form breaking apart into whispers of black smoke. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the Aurora Express was gone. The weight of reality. The cold bit into my skin immediately, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt alive. We were standing on a real snow-covered station. Dim lamps flickered above, casting a soft golden glow over the platform. And when I turned, I saw him. A man in a thick coat stood at the edge of the platform, staring at the spot where the train had been. His hair was streaked with grey, his hands weathered by time. His blue eyes met mine, and I stopped breathing. Dad? His face was full of recognition, but also uncertainty, as if he had just been pulled from a dream and was struggling to remember where he had been. Daniel exhaled in disbelief. Catherine. He's real. Tears blurred my vision. The train had taken him all those years ago, but now it had let him go. Because we had broken the rules, because we had broken the train. And in doing so, we had saved him. The end of the line. I didn't know how much time had passed, or how we explained what had happened to anyone else. The train was gone, leaving no evidence behind. But my father was here, and I knew, deep in my bones, that the Aurora Express wasn't coming back. Not for me, not for Daniel, not for anyone. The rules had been shattered, the conductor had lost, and finally, we were free. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I stood on solid ground. The train was gone, the air was sharp and cold, the wind carrying the scent of pine and distant snowfall. The platform beneath me was real, not some liminal space between life and death. I could feel the rough texture of the wooden planks beneath my boots, hear the distant howl of the wind in the mountains. But nothing felt more real than the man standing in front of me, my father. He looked older than I remembered. His face was weathered, his beard flecked with grey, his eyes sharp but haunted, like he had woken from a dream too long, too deep. "Dad," my voice cracked as I took a hesitant step toward him. He stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then softly, he said my name. "Catherine." The dam inside me broke. Tears blurred my vision as I ran toward him, colliding into his arms with a force that knocked the breath out of me. He let out a small, surprised grunt, then wrapped his arms around me so tightly it hurt. "I thought I lost you," I choked out. He let out a shaky breath. "I thought I was lost too." Daniel stood a few feet away, watching us with quiet relief. The wind ruffled his dark hair, and for the first time since we boarded the train, he looked at peace. But something still nagged at me. I pulled back and looked up at my father. "Dad, do you remember?" His face darkened. "Some of it, not all. It's like pieces of a dream that don't fit together. I remember being on that train. I remember the rules, and I remember the conductor." A shiver ran down my spine. "But you don't remember what happened before?" He hesitated, then slowly he shook his head. I exchanged a glance with Daniel. It made sense. The train had erased so many people, taken them, kept them in limbo. Maybe my father had been there for so long that his mind had lost the details of his past life. But he was here now. That was all that mattered. What the world remembers. The three of us walked away from the station, our footsteps crunching against fresh snow. I half expected the train to come back, to materialize from the darkness and drag us back into its endless looping nightmare. But the night remained still. We weren't in some strange in-between place anymore. We were home. The platform was small, nestled between towering pine trees. A single wooden signpost marked the station's name, half buried in snow. It read, "White Pass Station." The name sent a jolt through me. I knew this place. It was a small, nearly abandoned train station outside Skagway, Alaska. A historic stop for old railway lines that hadn't been used in decades. But if this was a real, earthly place, then how had we gotten here? Daniel seemed to read my mind. "No tracks," he muttered, scanning the ground. "No train schedule, no station master, no sign that anything has come through here in years." I swallowed. But we got here. And that meant no one else would ever believe us. I reached into my pocket, my fingers searching for any proof that the train had existed. But when I pulled my hand back, my ticket was gone. I glanced at Daniel. He was checking his pockets too. His expression turned grim. "Mine's gone." I looked at my father. He simply shook his head. The train had erased the evidence of its own existence, but it had existed. I knew it, and it had finally let us go. Unanswered questions. We reached a small road leading away from the station, the snow-covered path stretching into the darkness. "We should get moving," my father said, his voice stronger now. "There's a town a few miles from here. If this is really Skagway, we can find shelter." The three of us walked in silence for a while, the cold settling into our bones. But my mind wouldn't rest. The train had let us go. But why? We had broken the rules. We had destroyed our tickets, and somehow that had unraveled the train's hold over us. Had we truly defeated it? Or had we simply been allowed to leave? Daniel spoke up, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Do you think it's really over?" I hesitated before answering. "I don't know." Because deep down, in the furthest corners of my mind, I felt it. A presence. Distant but watching. Not the conductor, not the train, something else. Something that had been there all along. And somehow I knew. This wouldn't be the last time I heard its call. The night sky speaks. Hours later, we reached Skagway. A real town with real people, real streets. We found a small lodge to stay the night, warmed by a fireplace and the low murmur of conversation. My father sat beside the fire, staring at the flames, lost in thought. Daniel and I stood outside, staring up at the sky. The northern lights shimmered above, dancing in brilliant streaks of green and blue. They were beautiful, too beautiful, because I couldn't help but remember. The train had always followed the lights, always moved under them, like it was part of them, like it was drawn to something beyond human understanding. A cold feeling crept into my chest. What if? I hesitated, the words thick on my tongue. What if the train isn't really gone? Daniel turned to me, his expression unreadable. It probably isn't. I looked at him sharply. Then we didn't stop it. He shook his head. We didn't destroy it. We just escaped. The realization settled in like ice. The Aurora Express wasn't finished. It would keep running, keep collecting passengers, keep following the lights. And one day, maybe in a year, maybe in a decade, it would open its doors again. I exhaled, watching my breath vanish into the cold night air. We should warn people. Daniel gave a small, sad smile. Who would believe us? I had no answer, so I simply turned back toward the sky, watching the auroras swirl like ghostly flames. Somewhere out there, beyond the mountains, beyond the reach of the living world, the Aurora Express was still traveling, still waiting for its next passengers, and I could only hope that whoever boarded next would follow the rules, or else they'd never make it off alive. The Silent Screams, the channel of interesting horror stories. If you are new on this channel, then don't forget to subscribe The Silent Screams and press the bell icon for interesting stories.